Thanks. I'm Randy Lockwood. I'm Senior Vice President for Forensic Sciences at ASPCA, and I'm very pleased to be here. I think I've been involved with various Colorado projects for a very long time. Phil Tedeschi did not mention that he claims that I am directly responsible for his having been hit by a train because he was mulling over my presentation at the time, which distracted him. I don't want that burden on me, so I'll try to be less interesting maybe, or less, I don't know. But I don't want any more blood on my hands. And I have been involved in link-related issues for much of my career, probably since first working with Division of Youth and Family Services in New Jersey on the study linking child abuse and animal cruelty in one of the earlier studies, which really shifted my career away from focusing on primarily animal behavior and looking more at all dimensions of the human-animal bond, both the good that animals do for people, the harm that animals do to people, the harm that animals might do to people in terms of dog attack, and you know, the harm, obviously, that people do to animals. So looking at all the dimensions of human-animal relationships. What we want to focus on today is taking advantage of the fact that crimes against animals, particularly those involving family and domestic violence, and crimes involving young offenders or people at the early stage of their offense history, are getting increased attention from law enforcement and the public. We just recently completed a survey at ASPCA of law enforcement professionals, and the appreciation of the connection between animal cruelty and other forms of violence was very, very high, approaching 80–85% among different law enforcement leaders, which really has represented a shift in the last few years. One of the metrics that I find particularly inspiring to me of thinking that efforts like these have been worthwhile is looking at the number of states that now have felony animal cruelty laws. I gave my first link-type presentation back in 1984. At the time, there were 4 states in which animal torture might be prosecuted as a felony. We are now up to 46, and you've seen the almost exponential rise. This, I think, reflects the public's appreciation of the seriousness of animal cruelty, the seriousness of these connections. The public gets it, law enforcement gets it, prosecutors get it, sometimes judges get it. We're working on that more. But it really has produced incredible opportunities. And now what do we do with this? And that's what we're here for, trying to come up with some very practical and supportable approaches to making use of this. You know, relating animal crimes to human crimes. I work very closely with the National District Attorneys Association, and this is sort of their model of what the criminal justice, and particularly the juvenile justice system, is all about, the balanced and restorative justice model. Why do we have law enforcement? Why do we have laws? Well, the 3 major prongs of that are, first of all, to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions, to show that behavior has consequences and bad behavior has consequences. The second leg of that stool of the role of justice is community safety, identifying those who threaten the stability of communities, both individuals and the society as a whole. And the third part of that is dealing with the fact that most offenders are going to be back out on the street, often sooner than anybody might like. And are we prepared to deal with that? Are we prepared to deal with the competencies or lack of competencies that got them in trouble in the first place? And how do we, that's the restorative part. How can we identify people that can or cannot be fixed, or at least restored to a point where they are accountable for their actions and they are no longer a threat to the community? So that's our challenge in general, is how can we fit our efforts of taking animal cruelty seriously into this larger model of the criminal justice system of dealing with accountability, community safety, and competency development. And our challenge is for the next 2 days is first helping come up with criteria by which we decide which animal cruelty crimes should be given priority for investigation and prosecution. And based on what social criteria, primarily we'll be looking at risk factors. What level of accountability is appropriate for different crimes involving animals? How do we treat neglect and serious neglect differently from animal hoarding, from intentional animal abuse or torture, from animal sexual assault? One size obviously does not fit all. What kinds of public safety risks are associated with different kinds of animal offenses? And what are the perpetrator variables that we should be looking at? And the relationship between perpetrator and the victim, and many other variables we'll be discussing over the next day and a half. And finally, with the recognition that most people don't spend lots of time behind bars or in any other kind of secure environment, what are the prospects for improving competency in different types of animal cruelty offenders? And we have to recognize, first of all, that most people don't criminally offend. Most juvenile offenders don't usually escalate their offense. Many juveniles get in trouble once or twice, and then they kind of get over it and outgrow it or see that their behavior has had consequences. But many offenders do re-offend. And most criminal offenses are committed by a small number of people, and they are often re-offenses. And some repeat offenders escalate the level of violence and may escalate from animal cruelty to others, or it may be a general measure of their general deviance. So one challenge is to develop criteria that allow a more accurate assessment of the risk of continuing or escalating offenses based on what they actually did, based on the nature of the crime, and also based on societal standards of how that crime is viewed, both locally and globally. We have some young offenders, like this young man hauled in for his vehicular offense. Now he could escalate and go on, or he could become Bill Gates. Now, those of you trying to work through Microsoft Office 2010 may still consider him a criminal, but he is fairly typical of young men who do stupid stuff, pay the consequences, and don't re-offend. And then we have some chronic re-offenders. And how do we deal with chronic re-offense? Looking at, to my knowledge, neither one has been, neither Lindsay Lohan nor Charlie Sheen has had animal offenses, so I guess we're pretty safe from them. As mentioned by Phil, animal cruelty takes a lot of different forms. Neglect is obviously the most common that animal care and control agencies deal with. It's usually dealt with as an animal control issue, not a criminal issue. But then we get severe, wanton, or cruel neglect defined in different ways in different states. We get animal hoarding, which we won't be talking about very much, if at all, in this conference, because that requires an entirely different conference and entirely different models, but still is a serious issue with serious psychological overtones. We're going to be focusing on the intentional abuse. We probably won't talk much about organized abuse, blood sports, dogfighting, cockfighting. Won't talk much about ritualized abuse, although there might be elements of that in some of the intentional abuse. There will be some discussion of animal sexual assault. So the ones I've flagged in red are the ones I think that are going to be most relevant to our discussions over the next day and a half, particularly the intentional abuse part that is going to be linked to other forms of violence, child abuse, domestic violence, and other societal violence. As Frank Ascione and I have written, there are a bunch of different patterns when we see animal cruelty. Either it's going to get better, worse, or stay the same, pretty much. That if you have an animal cruelty offender, he or she may continue to offend at pretty much the same level. Or you might see that some other behavior emerges later. Or you might see the animal cruelty simply ends, and quite a few offenders, they do it once and it bothers them and they pay consequences, or they don't do it again. And we have the ones we're probably most concerned about where there appears to be a pattern of escalation, where the violence becomes more severe, where the targets perhaps become more vulnerable or more frequent. And then we have the issue that's not a concern, there's just no appearance of violence. So again, we're going to probably focus on issues primarily of escalation and perhaps maintenance, because those are the things that put society at greatest risk. So what are the indicators of the potential for escalation or at least maintenance? And from a therapeutic end, how do we move that, how do we shift that to desistance and stopping? What other competencies do we need to help the offender develop to reach desistance? I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all the stuff we usually talk about with kind of naive audiences to document the evidence for the link. You've got the major publications dealing with this, plus many other bibliographies are available. And Dr. Ascione will review some of the newer research later on this afternoon. But basically, this is a well-established connection with evidence coming from a variety of sources: the historical, anecdotal evidence, retrospective research looking backwards into the history of known violent offenders, into their earlier history involving animals, correlational research taking measures of societal violence, domestic violence, family violence, and correlating it to animal maltreatment, and prospective research, which is relatively rare and hard and expensive to do, but actually looking at populations of offenders, of animal offenders, and following them forward through history to see what else they do. And there is evidence from all of these different directions of such correlations. Of course, historically, we talk a lot about some of the classic offenders who have a documented history of animal cruelty. I often, since I live in Virginia, do talk about John Wilkes Booth and his admitted history in his diary of killing all the cats on his family farm. In contrast, of course, to his victim, Abraham Lincoln, who was noted for his kindness, particularly towards cats. Then we have other historical figures like Clyde Barrow of Bonnie and Clyde, who had a history of multiple acts of violence involving animals, as well as a pretty long human criminal history. The classic serial killer and connections like Son of Sam, who had an early history of about 1,000 acts of arson, multiple acts of animal cruelty, going back to age 7. Our poster child, Jeffrey Dahmer, looking at some of his connections. One person I've interviewed at length, Keith Jesperson, who, again, was one of the first serial killers I'd ever encountered, who really drew a direct connection between his killing of animals as a young boy and the empowerment he felt in committing homicide. And it's really one of the few people I've ever seen in writing who has said killing animals made him think, what would it feel like to kill a human being? He did it and he liked it. And he has been convicted of 8 homicides. And during my interviews and others, he's claimed about 120 homicides. So he's serving several life sentences in Oregon. And our school shooters like Luke Woodham. I'm going to take that as a given for most of you that you are familiar with this. Then we started, obviously, anecdotes are not necessarily data, but certainly in psychology, we call them case histories. And I don't dismiss the value of anecdotal evidence and these stories. And frankly, it is those stories which have opened the door to us. It is the stories of the Jeffrey Dahmers and Luke Woodhams and so on that get prosecutors and judges to pay attention to this connection. It's not hard science, it's not big numbers, but they are illustrative of the dynamics. And in working up assessment and in working up interventions, we need to be looking at the dynamics. What path did people take to get there? What was the role of their animal cruelty that led them to these thought processes that are so pathological? So I don't dismiss or downplay the value of individual case histories and the value of these historical things. Some hardcore academics might poo-poo, oh, those are just anecdotal evidence. But anecdotes are data. And obviously, when you go from an N of 1 to an N of 2, that's the most significant leap. You've doubled your sample size. The reality is, there's been a lot of misrepresentation of some of the historical data. There are quotes attributed to me, which I've never made, that say all serial killers started out killing animals. That's simply not true. And I have never said that. The best we can determine is we can document maybe 30 or 40% where we can actually look that far back, and that's still extremely impressive. So I don't think we need to oversell that connection, but I don't dismiss the anecdotal data. Sometimes there are link deniers out there, just as there are Holocaust deniers. And frankly, among the deniers are often the defendants in these criminal cases. You'll be hearing, I think we'll be talking this afternoon or tomorrow about Robert Pettyjohn, who committed multiple acts of serious animal cruelty, is still in prison after 10 years for his animal crimes. And his father, who is a physician, during his defense had said, well, there's no proof that there's a connection between animal cruelty and human violence, and even if there were, Bobby didn't do it. So he's my primary link denier. Those arguments fell on deaf ears, and his son is spending quite a bit of time in prison, and if we get a chance, you'll be seeing some prison videos of him. The second connection that we have, the second piece of evidence we have, is retrospective and correlational studies. Going back to MacDonald's early discussion of the homicidal triad, which obviously has largely been shifted away from, but he was one of the first, starting now almost 50 years ago, to make the connections between animal cruelty, fire setting, and at the time persistent enuresis. There have been many other studies beginning in the 60s and 70s. Many of these early articles are in the volume that Frank and I edited. But there got to be less and less support for the traditional triad, but stronger evidence of other kinds of predictive factors like social isolation, passivity, competence, other comorbid mental health issues. And a variety of retrospective studies of diverse incarcerated populations generally show incidence rates of prior repeated animal cruelty in childhood is 30 to 60%, as with our serial killers. It's there, it's frequently there, I would never say it's always there. A lot of people don't even have access to animals, particularly in people whose criminal career started 30 or 40 years ago. But certainly the connection is there. My own study that I did with Linda Merce-Perez in the Florida State Penitentiary was fairly typical of some of the old Hellman and Blackman and other studies, interviewing violent offenders of two types. We had the violent offenders, murderers and rapists primarily, and nonviolent offenders, mainly burglars and drug offenders. And then looking through interview techniques and record review and so on, showed that about 56% of the violent offenders had repeated acts of past cruelty to animals, about 20% of the nonviolent offenders, and the general population, the incidence is 3 to 5%, depending on your definitions. So this is fairly typical of the kind of data that's already out there. Data like this is still being collected, but it comes out pretty consistently. Give me a population of nasty people behind bars, give me access to their past history involving animals, interviewing anybody who's dealt with them. It's usually not enough just to look at their rap sheet, because animal cruelty crimes, particularly 10 or 15 years ago, might not have even been reported or recorded. But you're going to find half to 2/3 did have animal cruelty histories in their growing up. Frank will talk about some of the other studies, again looking at the Achenbach scale, again looking retrospectively at reports. These are some of the correlational studies. You have a population of children that have been referred from mental health services, and again you find reported incidence of cruelty rates generally between 25 and 30% among children who have been exposed to violence either as victims or witnesses. Other correlational studies like the Vaughan's National Epidemiological Study. This is the biggest survey over 43,000 psychiatric interviews that were looked at, and animal cruelty prevalence was a little under 2% and was strongly associated with other antisocial behaviors, conduct disorder, alcohol abuse, and as Phil Tedeschi said, all of these things are often interconnected, and one of our challenges is in dealing with all these separate issues, which might be substance abuse, conduct disorder related stuff, as well as the animal cruelty. There are a handful of prospective studies. Probably they usually have relatively small sample sizes. One of the first was done by Justice, looking at a small number of animal cruelty offenders, but had seen fire setting, particularly burning of cats, as a predictive feature in that. Most of you are familiar with the MSPCA study following prosecuted animal abusers, most of whom were male, most of whom were under 30, and then comparing their offense rate to matched controls over a 10-year window, and again showing the animal abusers were much more likely to be involved in other crimes. What this study failed to show was a true progression. It really showed more of a general social deviance model, because they were often as likely to commit the crime against the animal after some of these other crimes as they were before. And there are methodological issues here, because back in 1975 we weren't prosecuting juvenile offenders for animal cruelty, and their records often were sealed. So there very well may be a progression, but this methodology would not have been really good at capturing that. Another study, again relatively small, looking at children at risk due to family violence, having the mothers classify them as either fire setters or cruel to animals. Very small number classified as both, but again looking 10 years down the road, that most of those classified as both were referred for violent offenses to the juvenile justice system. So the numbers are small, the connections are pretty good, but these are very difficult studies to carry out. But they consistently show this. What we have, just in my relatively brief career dealing with these issues, I have seen a major change. I was trained on the old DSM-3, and animal cruelty is nowhere in there. It just wasn't mentioned. It wasn't diagnostic of anything. Then just about the time I was now teaching, was no longer a student, the 3R came out, and cruelty to animals was mentioned as being diagnostic of conduct disorder as destruction of property. And then when the DSM-4 came out, it's now been moved to violence against others. And this really reflects both our profession's view of animal cruelty and society's view of animal cruelty. Prior to 1988, no big deal, irrelevant, not even mentioned. 1988, it's a property crime. Well, it's still a property crime. Animal cruelty, animals are still property, and animal cruelty technically is a property crime. You're depriving someone of the enjoyment of their property rather than as a morals crime or crime against society. But since 1994, at least in the DSM, we see it as violence against others. That's a very subtle recognition of the link. When you kill someone's cat, it's quite different from smashing someone's toaster oven, even though the toaster oven probably cost more than the cat, and as property, it's worth more. But the line I've often used is, if I have a boy that throws a rock through the window of a vacant building, and I have a boy who throws a rock through the stained glass window of a church, and I have a boy who throws a rock and kills a cat, those are three very different boys from my view of risk assessment, and what it tells us about what we need to do with those boys, how we need to treat them in the juvenile justice system. But still, under the law, the cat and the abandoned building window are probably equivalent, and the stained glass window, because it costs more, is a more serious crime. And that's the disconnect that we're often dealing with, the psychological implication of the crime and the financial implication of the crime. And I think it's our job to help educate prosecutors, judges, and our colleagues in mental health to recognize the importance and the significance of those differences. So what I've tried to do, and what we'll be working on for part of this session, is trying to develop some risk assessment tools. I don't claim to be an authority on risk assessment, and many of you, I think, are far more familiar and far more skilled in using some of the existing tools for other kinds of offenders, particularly in domestic violence or sexual assault. But I've tried to draw a little bit on some of the classic tools to come up with some more formal assessment based on what we've intuitively learned from dealing with lots and lots of animal cruelty cases over the last 25 years. And we have various sex offender risk scales that I've reviewed, and probably there are others better or more useful, but I've at least taken a look at some of these. We have longer standing tools like psychopathy scales, classification of violence risk scales. I'm interested, even though it's not a formal clinical assessment tool, I am interested in some of the research on the depravity scale, partly because that research basically has sought to interview thousands of professionals on how you would define depravity, partly because in cases of capital punishment, often one of the criteria for elevating a homicide to a capital crime is that it was committed with a depraved sense. Looking at our own animal cruelty and animal torture laws, often there's similar wording: with a hardened heart, with a depraved mind. These are undefined legal terms. Probably it's up to us who deal with offenders who do things that society considers to be really sick and twisted, to try to come up with perhaps more objective criteria for how depraved is depraved. Usually it winds up kind of being a duck test. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, we call it a duck. If you ask someone, well, this kid kicked a pit bull, broke its rib because it was attacking him, and the pit bull later died, versus this person stole a pit bull puppy from his neighbor and set fire to it, I think we intuitively know, oh, well, that's really sick, the use of fire or whatever. But how can we quantify that? How can we find consensus on that? So we have a couple of methodological issues we're going to have to try to tackle over the next day and a half. First of all, one of the hot topics is how much cruelty to animals is normal. Some people have called it sort of dark play or things like that. And clearly, many juveniles engage in activities where they don't maybe necessarily recognize the seriousness of what they're doing. And so really, what is the normative level? And a lot of that certainly depends on how we define cruelty. Often there is very poor incident detail of animal cases prior to felony laws. I tried to go back to the Massachusetts ASPCA study, since we knew progressive history of those who had been convicted of animal cruelty, and we know what offenses they committed later. I was interested in seeing if I could validate my instrument by looking at the details of the crimes they had been convicted of. But the data in the MSPCA records was pretty inadequate. Very little description of what was actually done, what the specifics of the case, or how the perpetrator described his or her own involvement in the case. Another issue we have in trying to look at validating some of these measures is that juvenile records are usually sealed or non-existent. And except in very, very high profile cases or cases where juvenile offenders are prosecuted in adult court, we often don't have access to those records. We're seeing more and more cases where that's true, where we have young offenders, and I'm involved in a couple of cases right now. Many of you are probably familiar with the Phoenix case in Baltimore, where two brothers did steal a pit bull and set fire to it. They have been charged with felony animal cruelty as adults. They had their first trial last month. It was a hung jury, 11 to convict. One said she just couldn't convict those boys of anything. The trial begins again May 4th, their retrial. And that's one where we now have records, partly because I did testify to have this moved into adult court. Okay. One of our other issues, as we'll see, I think from some of the examples, if you want to try to understand what's going on with our offenders, animal cruelty perpetrators are often not terribly insightful. Probably the phrase I hear most from kids that have committed serious acts of animal cruelty when I ask them why, it's, "We was bored." That doesn't tell me much psychologically. It tells me some of the competencies that they lack, but it doesn't tell me much. And the other thing is, you know, to paraphrase Margaret Mead, you know, she had said the worst thing that can happen to a child is to commit a violent act against an animal and get away with it. The fact that a case is in the criminal justice system, by definition, means the kid didn't get away with it. So by definition, any case that we have access to the records of, that child has already had some consequences for his or her behavior. It's the ones we didn't catch, the ones that killed stray animals and nobody ever found out about it, maybe that we hear about, you know, years and years later. Those are the ones that we need to be very concerned about, and those are the ones that are hard to catch data from. So I'm going to stop at this point because then we'll be working on the specifics of my instrument and other instruments. But what I've tried to do in developing some techniques for trying to get a sense of what are the cases we need to be concerned about is, first of all, I looked at many of the retrospective studies of acts of cruelty to animals reported by violent offenders. You know, I read the actual accounts that went into the data of those retrospective studies, like Linda Mertz-Perez's and others. Obviously, read extensively on the reports of acts of cruelty committed or associated with child abuse and domestic violence. A lot of the literature and case histories that Frank and Phil and others have done. I've also worked closely with FBI profiler groups and the National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime, and some of the things in the checklist that's in your material is modified from the VICAP or the Canadian VICLAS. And also just looking at other studies of habitual and violent offenders. I admit to my own naivete in this, but I think the fact that we've got so many people here interested in trying to come up with something, I think we're off to a good start. And a lot of this is frankly not rocket science. It is intuitive. You know the really scary stuff when you see it. And it would be nice to have consensus on what things are scarier. I seem to find I'm being called in to apply my scale or to help testify in disposition hearings more and more frequently in cases of animals that have been burned or otherwise tortured. And for a variety of historical and clinical reasons, those do jump out at me. And my intuitive feeling is these are some of the most disturbed individuals I've seen, a lot different from the shootings, stabbings, or whatever, but we'll discuss those at greater length. So I'm going to stop at this point, because I think we're coming up on a break, and then later on this afternoon we'll go through the specifics of some of the elements that I think need to go into an assessment, why I've chosen them, what the relevance might be, and then our working task for the rest of the session is integrating this and other stuff into coming up with some measures that might help all of us. Great. Okay, thank you very much.